1969, Joan Robinson Hill died of an infection of unknown origin. Her father was sure it was murder, and due to pressure, charges were eventually filed. But what happened next muddied the water more than it already was in this case of unknowns. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. This is a part 2, so I hope you made it through part 1 first. At the end of the last episode, I made a lot of promises of what's coming up next, so we need to get into that, but I need to give you a quick recap of the timeline first, just so we're all on the same page about where we're picking back up. Joan Robinson Hill died in mid-March 1969. 2 autopsies said she died of an infection. Different infections, but an infection nonetheless. The DA called a grand jury that didn't hand down an indictment. Then Joan's widower, John, remarried less than 3 months after her death, and he married the woman he had been having an affair with. The DA then called a second grand jury that also did not indict, but they did hand down an exhumation order. So Joan was exhumed and re-autopsied in August of 1969 by several doctors this time who were basically on 2 teams. One of those teams found that Joan died of natural causes, specifically meningitis. While the other team's results were still pending, John separated from his new wife in late October, and they divorced in March of 1970. Right after the divorce was final, the new ex-wife, Ann Kurth, testified in front of a third grand jury. Why were there so many grand juries for a woman who died, according to 3 autopsies, of natural causes? It's because Joan's father, Ash Robinson, was rich and powerful in Houston, and he was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that his son-in-law was responsible for Joan's death. Some put forward a secondary motive for Ash. If John was found guilty of killing Joan, Ash would get all of the shares in the house that John and Joan had purchased, and very likely custody of his grandson, a grandson he was not getting to see in the aftermath of all of this. And I see this in a lot of cases. This is not a unique dynamic by any stretch. When one side of the family thinks the spouse killed their loved one, and they're vocal about it, the parent doesn't want their child around them. And I see both sides of it. Kids should be connected to the other side of their family, especially after losing a parent. And having grandparents they saw regularly suddenly disappear from their lives adds to this trauma. But it's also harmful to children to be around people who are regularly bad-mouthing one of their parents. We really shouldn't be gossiping with children to begin with, but imagine if that gossip is about how their father killed their mother. It could be very frightening to them to hear that and then have to go home to that parent. Joan and John's son was only 9 years old at this time, and I guess the bottom line is that once again, it's the kids who are paying for adult behavior. But it wasn't just his son John wanted to prevent from hearing about how he supposedly killed his wife. He wanted the whole town to stop hearing about it. And to do that, he had to stop the person who was saying it. So in March of 1970, around the time of John's divorce from his second wife, he filed a defamation lawsuit against Ash Robinson for $10 million. And he would not have a hard time proving damages. In the year before Joan's death, John's business had made $152,000, which is like $1.2 million in today's money. Now, I'm not 100% sure if that's all the money paid to him, or that's just how much they brought in overall, or if it includes profits reinvested in the business. I don't know the details, but regardless, it was a lot of money. And John saw this number fall sharply after Joan's death. And it wasn't because Joan died. It wasn't even because he remarried so quickly. It was because Ash Robinson went around town telling everyone John was a murderer. And it's not in dispute whether Ash did that or not. The question in a defamation case would be if what Ash said was a lie or not. In the big picture, this lawsuit didn't impact much, but it did let John's attorney subpoena witnesses and take depositions, which gave them a clue as to what was being said to the third grand jury that was meeting about this case. Because as we know, grand jury testimony is secret, but John's attorneys were able to then ask these questions in depositions. The grand jury proceedings being done in secret was pretty frustrating when I was going through the newspaper archives at newspapers.com, of course. The public interest in this case was as high as you can imagine it would be, but there was not a lot that could be reported on about the grand jury. So there would be articles that were vague, telling you who testified, but they wouldn't tell you what they testified about. There was one about a woman and her son who were called to testify about some incident that happened in the summer of 1969, but that is all they would say. As time has passed, though, things have come out in other ways, so we can fill in some of the blanks, and we know what summer incident was witnessed by these two people because Anne testified about it, and she basically accused John of trying to kill her. This was exactly what John's attorneys were afraid of, and why they literally told him not to divorce Anne. If he was unhappily married once, he could do it again to keep Anne from, in revenge, telling tales. Or from telling the truth, depending on how you see it. Some people saw her as credible and some did not, and John's attorneys did not want him to take the risk. But he said he just couldn't stand living with her any longer, and he accused her of violence towards him. So the day after their divorce was final, Anne testified in front of the grand jury and told them about an incident that happened on June 30th, 1969, at about 3 a.m. What is undisputed is that the two got into a one-car wreck while John was driving. John's version of the story is pretty straightforward. They were driving, he and Anne got into an argument, and she grabbed the wheel. He lost control and hit a concrete bridge wall on the passenger side. Anne's story was a lot more than that. What she told the DA, the grand jury, and then eventually a jury during a trial are more or less the same story, just sometimes with a few more details thrown in. So let's just go over the totality of what she said happened. Anne said that they were out at dinner and John got mad at her for bringing something up that he was touchy about. What had happened was John did questioning with the DA under the influence of a truth serum, which is a barbiturate. He was trying to clear his name from the accusations Ash was putting out there. Anne said she saw John give himself an injection before the interview, which he said was some type of vitamin shot, but she suspected it was an antidote to the barbiturate they gave him for the test. And I tried to look up what that could be and got nothing. The only kind of antidote I found was something you can give after someone overdosed. I used all sorts of search terms to try to find something you could take ahead of time that might lessen the effects of a barbiturate, and I found nothing. It seems the only obvious way to lessen the effects of a barbiturate is to just be a regular user and build up a tolerance, which John couldn't have done in a single injection. Otherwise, my Google-level research on this indicates that people are simply not worried about barbiturates that have not been taken yet. They're more worried about ones that have, so there's not a lot of literature on the topic. Anyway, Anne said that John was complaining at dinner that people at the hospital still side-eyed him when he thought doing the truth serum interview would have cleared him. And Anne brought up the injection, basically saying she wished he had done the test straight. John got angry and he spoke very sternly and loudly, so much so that people noticed, according to Anne. I haven't seen anyone in the restaurant back this up, but Anne said it was very embarrassing. Dinner ended tensely, according to Anne, and John said he had to stop at the hospital before they headed home. Anne said she waited in the car while he went in there for about an hour. It was getting late at this point. It was around midnight, and John suggested they go for a drive and listen to some classical music. Anne agreed, though after driving for hours, she said they needed to go home. She was tired, their boys were at home, and she was just done with this drive. But instead of heading home, she said John started talking. And what he was talking about was Joan. John said that he didn't want things to have happened the way they happened. He just wanted a divorce, but he knew Joan and Ash would never have granted him one. So he was stuck. He said he started collecting samples at the hospital from sick patients. He would take these infected bodily fluids home and culture them in petri dishes to let them grow. Anne said she actually saw the petri dishes in his apartment bathroom one night, and he told her they were just an experiment, so his admission about growing cultures clicked in her brain. John said he put this stuff he grew into the pastries that he was serving Joan during the week leading up to her death, which again backed up something Anne claimed she saw. She was at his apartment, and there was a pastry that he, with some urgency, told her not to eat. But the pastries didn't make Joan sick, or at least not sick enough. So when she was nauseous and John gave her an injection to help with it, he included the cultures in the shot. And that's what finally did it. According to Anne, John said Joan had, quote, every disease known to man. During this confession, John was still driving, and it was at about that point in the conversation that John pulled down a road and Anne realized they were near Joan's old Chatsworth horse farm. John gestured to the sign for the farm, said that the person who lived at that farm, quote, doesn't live anymore, and then he said, and neither do you, before he purposely slammed the car into the bridge wall on Anne's side. She was not wearing her seatbelt, so she was able to move closer to John's side before impact and avoid getting seriously hurt. Anne said John then reached into his pocket, pulled out a syringe, and attempted to stab her with it. They were in a physical struggle over the needle, and Anne managed to knock the syringe out of his hand, but then he reached into his pocket again and pulled out another syringe. But before he could stab her with it, another car pulled up and the occupants got out to see if John and Anne were okay. These were the two people that were called to testify at the grand jury. According to Anne, John threw the syringe that was in his hand out of the car window into the grass. The other car gave them a ride to the hospital so Anne could be checked out. And when she and John went back to the crash site the next day to get some things from the car, that included getting the other syringe that had been knocked to the floor. That syringe was then disposed of, so there was no proof to any aspect of Anne's story except the part about them crashing into the wall. I know Anne's story sounds like a made-for-TV Lifetime drama. And there is one detail I held back that might make her story seem even less plausible to you. John had been in a motorcycle crash the week before, and he had broken his collarbone. So one of his arms was in a sling. And from what I have heard from people who have had broken collarbones, even if John could maneuver all of this stabbing with a syringe and reaching into his pocket with one arm in a sling, he would have been in a lot of pain from that much movement, not to mention twisting in his seat to face Anne during this attack. Unless he was on some serious painkillers, which is possible, he would have done all of this through quite a bit of pain. I also think this would be a very strange and likely to fail way to kill someone. Crashing into the bridge wall could have hurt both of them equally, and it doesn't sound like it was at a deadly speed. And having a pocket of uncapped syringes full of what exactly in his pocket that would kill her? And also, what would it look like if, while being investigated for the death of one wife, if John had another wife die? The whole thing sounds pretty out there, so either it's not true or John really was incredibly reckless at this point and just unraveling. When the grand jury heard this story from Anne, they had the opportunity to ask some questions, And Anne was ready for that because the DA had already grilled her privately to make sure there were no holes in her story. But one question a grand juror asked that I thought was very insightful was to the DA. How much of Anne's story would even be admissible if this went to trial? And the DA had to be honest. He had no idea. Texas spousal privilege laws were and are pretty tight. In addition to hearing from Anne, the grand jury also finally heard the autopsy results from Ash's team from the third autopsy. If you remember, there were multiple doctors involved, and John Hill's side already made their ruling of meningitis. But Ash's medical examiner, who he hired from New York, just kept saying that he expected his results in a week or 2 weeks or soon, and that dragged on for more than half a year. And his results didn't clear things up at all. He also found that Joan died of an infection that involved her liver, esophagus, and inner membranes of her brain. The exact infection was unknown and always would be because Joan was embalmed before her blood could be tested. But he believed the way the germs entered her body was through the digestive tract. So Anne's story of injections wasn't necessarily what he thought happened, but those mysterious pastries might be. Or Joan could have just eaten something else that was contaminated. He didn't know, so he didn't speculate. But that didn't mean the state wouldn't. The ME also, very importantly, ruled that the delay in hospitalization aggravated the situation. Had Joan gotten help earlier, she may have survived. And this was the opening for charges. They had no pastries, they had no syringes or petri dishes to test. Everything Anne said existed was just a memory, and it was long since disposed of, if, 1, they existed at all, and 2, were relevant to the case. But the prosecution grabbed onto the fact that Joan may have been saved with earlier treatment. And who did they say prevented that earlier treatment? According to the state's argument, it was Dr. John Hill. In Texas, neglecting to get someone appropriate medical care that leads to their death can be charged as criminally negligent homicide or manslaughter. This would be if someone acted reckless or outside of what a reasonable person would do in not getting the sick or injured person help. But that feels like a slap on the wrist if you think John purposely infected his wife, but you just can't prove it. So the state went for a rather rare murder charge. If a suspect purposely withheld medical treatment so that the person would die, that's intentional homicide. It was basically a murder by omission, rarely charged in the United States since the founding of the country, because it is so very hard to prove intent. That was the theory of the crime the state was going with, and I don't think John's testimony to the grand jury helped. Well, he denied everything. He denied hurting Joan, denying her medical care. He denied attacking Anne. His manner from the stand was detached. It was unemotional. Glib was the word used in the book Blood and Money about how one grand juror saw him. He was testifying about the death of his wife that left his son without a mother, and he didn't seem to care that much. That emotionless delivery could have just been his personality, but I think it helped the grand jury, rightly or wrongly, in making their decision. In a 10-2 vote, the grand jury indicted Dr. John Hill with murder, saying that he, quote, did voluntarily and with malice aforethought kill the said Joan Hill by willfully, intentionally, and culpably failing and omitting to administer to her proper medical treatment, end quote. Under this theory, the state would not have to prove that John purposely made Joan sick, just that he knew how sick she was and decided to let her die. His murder weapon was a conveniently timed illness, though the prosecution would still allude to John having caused her illness at trial. The jury just didn't have to believe it completely to convict. And that's important because, like I said, a lot of the evidence of how John would have administered an illness to his wife was in Ann Kurth's mouth, and they didn't know how credible the jury would find her if her testimony was even admissible. I've been decluttering and refreshing my wardrobe as part of my spring cleaning, and I find that I am just continually drawn to pieces that are well-made and easy to reach for every day. It's a very quality over quantity mindset, and Quince has absolutely found its place in my closet. The fabrics feel elevated, the designs are intentional, and the pricing actually makes sense. Quince's spring style is focused on lightweight and breathable materials, and like their entire collection, these are beautiful pieces using premium materials like 100% European linen, organic cotton, and super soft denim. Quince works directly with ethical factories and cuts out the middleman, so you're paying for quality and not the brand markup. Styles start right around $50, and they're the kinds of things you can throw on and look put together. That same focus on materials and quality carries over into their accessories, like their leather bags, which are made from 100% hand-woven Italian leather, and honestly, they look way more expensive than they are. I absolutely love my Quince trapeze bag. The leather is the right amount of softness while still holding its shape, and the quality is right up there with bags I paid a lot more for. Refresh your spring wardrobe with Quince. Go to quince.com/crimelines for free shipping and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. Go to quince.com/crimelines for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/crimelines.
I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
I am sorry if this is redundant for those of you who listen to every episode, but in case you've not heard of cases where this comes up, spousal privilege works differently in different jurisdictions. In some places, either person can waive it, but in Texas, as long as one spouse invokes it, it applies to both of them. John was not going to concede that he ever confessed to Anne during their marriage, but he certainly was not going to agree to let her tell a jury about it, true or not. So John's attorney, the famous Richard Racehorse Haynes, asked the judge that Anne be kept off the stand entirely. He was invoking his spousal privilege. The state argued that there was an exception to this privilege, which there was. Spouses are allowed to testify about any violence against them during the marriage. So they were saying because Anne was allowed to testify about that, she could testify about anything that was said or done during the attack in the car. This exception usually applies to criminal charges against the abusive spouse for the abuse, not charges against them for something unrelated. So this was a shaky interpretation of the law, but the judge agreed with the state and allowed Anne to testify at John's murder trial, which was held in February of 1971. But this testimony was limited. She could not say anything about his long confession about killing Joan. She could only testify to things that happened with the crash and the syringe attack. But before Anne even made it to the stand, the state did put on some other important witnesses, like Joan's maid Effie, who testified about how sick Joan was, and Diane, Joan's house guest at the time of her illness, who testified about John insisting that Joan eat these pastries, and also about how John entertained guests with a comedy movie right after Joan died. What I thought was most interesting about their testimony, though, was the cross-examinations of both of these witnesses. Of Effie, John's attorney Racehorse Haynes asked about her leaving John's employment. Effie said she left a few weeks after Joan's death, but only because her own husband became ill. She actually liked John, and she said she would go work for him again if she was needed. This was a state's witness, someone close to their victim in her final hours, and she was not worried that the defendant was a killer. And on Diane's cross-examination, Haynes asked her about Joan's sexual orientation. As reported in the Houston Chronicle, he asked if Joan was gay or straight. Diane seemed confused by this question, so he clarified that he was very specifically asking about her attraction to men and women, and Diane said she was straight as far as she knew. Haynes then asked her about her own orientation and that of a few of their other friends, and Diane continued to answer the same way. As far as she knew, everyone was straight. Which wasn't actually true. I'm not saying that Joan was gay or bisexual, but women in their circle were. We all know I don't care about anyone's sexuality, but I'm wondering why Racehorse Haynes cared. What was this line of questioning about? Was he going to accuse Diane or her roommate Eunice, who was also a house guest, of making stuff up about the pastries and about John's attitude because one of them was secretly in love with Joan and seeking revenge? We don't actually know because we don't get that far into the trial to learn where, if anywhere, this was going, because Ann Kurth took the stand and blew the whole thing up. It wasn't her credibility, though that was an angle the defense was planning to attack. It wasn't even her theatrical storytelling, which the judge asked her to cool it on multiple times. It was that she went too far in the scope of her testimony. Anne was allowed to testify about seeing petri dishes in the bathroom, and then about the next day being warned not to eat a pastry. And then she got to the events that happened in June of 1969 regarding the car wreck. Anne got to the part where John was trying to stab her with the syringe, and she was asked, was he attempting to treat her, like give her a sedative after the crash to calm her down, or was he trying to hurt her? Did she know which it was? And Anne answered that she knew what he intended. The prosecutor pushed and asked if it was because of something he said before trying to attack Anne, and she said yes. So the prosecutor clarified, immediately before, and Anne said it was because John had told her that he killed Joan with a needle. Haynes immediately objected and asked for a mistrial. This was the exact thing Anne was not allowed to say, and she had never claimed that John made the confession during the attack and trying to stab her with the syringe. In her original story, he told her that before the crash even happened. The judge initially denied the motion for a mistrial, but then he heard counsel out in chambers on the issue. The state knew they were getting Anne's testimony in on shaky spousal privilege ground, and it was already going to be an appealable issue. But once Anne brought in something else entirely that she was not allowed to say, the judge had to know that if there was a conviction, John was going to waltz through an appeal at this point. So, in the interest of justice, he declared a mistrial. Neither side was very happy about this. The state knew that Anne was not going to be any more credible at a retrial, and they'd have to be even more careful with her on the stand. Every spot where she deviated in her testimony from the grand jury to the trial to the next trial would be an opening for John's attorneys. As for the defense, you might wonder why they asked for a mistrial if they didn't really want one, and it's not the attorneys who didn't want one. They didn't know how Anne's statement landed with the jury, and telling a jury just to disregard a defendant's supposed confession isn't that easy. It is hard to unring a bell like that. Plus, if you want to preserve an issue for appeal, you do have to make a motion during the trial. It was mostly John who didn't want the mistrial because he didn't think the jury believed Anne. Her lack of credibility, plus the defense's lineup of medical experts ready to testify, would have led to an acquittal in his mind. The defense was even going to point out that several people saw Joan sick on Sunday and Monday, including Ash Robinson, and no one thought she was so sick that she needed to be hospitalized until Tuesday, which is when John brought her in. It's not like he had her isolated and was the only one seeing her. Other people could have intervened. And it looks like John was right in his assessment of how the trial was going. When they informally polled the jury, it turned out they were leaning towards an acquittal. And that is worth noting because the state was already through the strongest parts of their case, and the defense hadn't even gone yet. So knowing this, the DA's office had to debate whether this was worth a retrial at all. But let's face it, Ash Robinson was why there were 3 grand juries, why there were so many autopsies, and why charges were brought in the first place. And he wasn't going to lay off the pressure after a mistrial. And that led to the state deciding to bring John Hill to trial again. But as happens, they had a few delays due to witness illnesses and scheduling conflicts, but finally it looked like this retrial was set for November of 1972. Between the February 1971 trial and the scheduled retrial, John Hill married for a 3rd time. And this time he married someone who shared his interests. He married a woman named Connie, who had studied music from childhood and was a vocalist. She could talk to John about obscure musical compositions, and she never found it dull or boring like Joan did. Unfortunately for John, Connie had never heard of him. So when they met in December of 1969 during his separation from Anne, she gave him a chance and didn't immediately run because of all the rumors swirling about him. Probably best of all, particularly considering where all of this is going, John and Joan's son loved Connie. After losing his mother and dealing with his father's quick and tumultuous remarriage, he deserved someone like Connie to come into his life. Another change between the trials was that public opinion started to shift. I think that first trial helped John Hill in the court of public opinion because everyone saw what the jury saw. They knew how odd Anne's story of the syringe attack sounded, and then the idea of homegrown bacteria in contaminated pastries, it sounded outlandish. Not that it couldn't have happened, but really, they saw the state's case laid out, and I imagine the words, "that's it," came to mind for many of them. So things started to turn around for John. He was happily married, colleagues started referring patients to him again, and as more space was being put between him and Joan's death, the more things were getting back to normal. In September of 1972, 2 months before the retrial was supposed to happen, John and Connie took a trip out of town. They left on September 14th to first go to Seattle for a family wedding, then to California, before they headed to Las Vegas for a medical conference that John was attending. While they were out of town, John's mother, Myra, stayed at the house with John and Joan's son. John and Connie flew back from Las Vegas to Houston on the evening of September 24th, 1972, and they planned to take a cab from the airport to their house, and they expected to be home between 7:30 and 8 that night. At 7:30, there was someone at the door, and John's 12-year-old son ran to answer it, thinking it was his dad and Connie back from their trip. Except it was a man he had never seen before. Myra, who also came to the door, was confused and asked the man if he was one of John's patients, and he said no, this was a robbery. After binding and gagging both the boy and his grandmother, the intruder pulled out a pillowcase with 2 eyes cut out and put it over his head. Hiding his face after they got a good look at him seemed odd, but that is what he did. The man was in another part of the house when the doorbell rang again. It was just before 7:45, and this time it was Connie and John, having just arrived home from their trip. Myra tried to yell out for John to run, but she was gagged, so there was no way he would have heard her, but she had to try. The intruder heard it, though, and came into the room. He kicked Myra in the throat and then kicked the boy and told Myra to shut up. He then went to the door, and Connie laughed when she saw him. He had this weird pillowcase on his head, and she thought it was funny and surprising, and she didn't know what was going on. He then reached out and grabbed either her necklace or her collar and started to pull her into the house while saying this was a robbery. John reached over to force him to let Connie go, and when she was free, she turned and ran to a neighbor's house to call for help. And as she ran, she heard gunshots. John's son also heard the shots and then heard the man say, "Where's the rest of your money?" And then silence. The boy managed to get the gag out of his mouth and he hobbled over to the phone, where he dialed the operator to tell them that his father had been shot and needed help. Then, still bound, he half-hopped over to his father, who had been shot multiple times and was lying unresponsive in a pool of blood. 41-year-old Dr. John Hill was dead. The police announced that this was an apparent robbery, but Myra said that was wrong. She knew that man was there to kill John. He seemed to be in the house waiting, and though he took John's wallet and briefcase, it doesn't seem like anything else in the house had been touched. And it would turn out Myra was right. It would take the police a little while to realize her assessment was spot on, but it all started when they got a break in their investigation 4 days after the murder. There were some kids playing in a yard in John Hill's neighborhood, and they found John's discarded briefcase. Their parents called the police, and a massive search of all of the surrounding properties began. It turned out the briefcase was not the only thing the killer ditched before he even left the neighborhood. A gun was found just 70 feet from where the briefcase had been found. The police hoped the gun was registered. Registration of this specific type of gun was legally required, but that registration hadn't started until 1968, and it was 1972, and this was not a new gun. It was already rusted. If the last time it was legally acquired was pre-1968, they would be out of luck. But luck was on the investigator's side this time because it was last bought in 1969, so it was registered, and it was registered to a doctor. Given that John was also a doctor, they had to wonder if there was a professional connection. They went to speak with this doctor, who had no idea who Dr. John Hill was, but he did admit that he had bought the gun, and he said it was stolen. He was hesitant to tell the full story, but basically, he had hired a sex worker who came to his house, and while he was in the bathroom, she stole the gun and took off. He knew her as Dusty, but he was pretty sure her real name was Marcia McKittrick. So the police had Marcia McKittrick's name within the first week or so of the investigation, and then it took them nearly a year to find her. She was based in Dallas, but she stayed wherever she could find a hotel that would host her for a period of time. She would work in that city for a couple of weeks and then move on. Sometimes she would circle back around to visit her regulars, which is how she ended up at the doctor's house in order to steal the gun. This was not a very traceable lifestyle, particularly in a pre-digital era. As they were investigating Marcia and looking for her, they got a tip on who her pimp was. So they went and looked for him, but it turned out he was doing 15 years in prison and had been since before John's murder. So then they learned from an informant that she had another pimp named Bobby something. Maybe his surname started with a V, but they didn't know. And someone named Bobby V isn't much to go on. Though, strangely enough, they ended up finding Bobby before they found Marcia. An informant in the Dallas area told the police that he knew about a guy named Bobby who was wanted for a murder in Houston. He let them know where Bobby was hiding out, so they moved in and arrested 33-year-old Bobby Vandiver 7 months after John's murder, and he fit the description of the shooter. In a lineup, John's son identified 2 men as the possible intruder, and Bobby was one of them, but his grandmother Myra recognized him immediately. Blood and Money really gets into Bobby and Marcia's backstories and their time on the run, which was very interesting, but it would make this episode a 3-parter if I included it all, so I recommend the book if you want to get more into their backstories. But with Bobby in custody, the police questioned him about John Hill's murder, and he denied everything. He even denied knowing Marcia until they dropped another name, Lilla Paulus. Lilla Paulus was someone Joan Hill knew through her horse world, and when Marcia McKittrick would visit Houston, she would regularly stay with Lilla. A tip came in suggesting a connection, and Lilla seemed like the strongest connection the police could find between the Hills and Marcia McKittrick. It seems strange that a woman who moved in the same social circles as Joan Robinson Hill was also connected to a young transient like Marcia McKittrick, but Lilla kind of straddled two worlds. She loved horses and her daughter took riding lessons, but she wasn't exactly a socialite herself. Her husband was a bookie, allegedly, and he would take bets and money from those in quote-unquote society. He also owned some rental properties in Galveston that would later be characterized in court as brothels. So the Paulus family had a nice income to have their child in writing lessons and private schools, but their businesses may not have been entirely on the up and up. Marcia met Lilla through a mutual friend, and Lilla would let her stay at her house when she was in town. Lilla would later deny that her husband was a bookie and that the rental properties in Galveston were anything other than rental properties, but it's hard to understand how she would have met Marcia if there wasn't some way she was connected to her world. Lilla did know that Marcia was a sex worker, and her only rule for Marcia's time staying with her in Houston was that she couldn't bring any clients back to Lilla's house. So that is how Lilla is connected to Joan Robinson Hill and Marcia McKittrick. But she was not someone Bobby expected the police to bring up or even know about, and his surprise pretty much gave him away, which was good for the investigators because they were overplaying their hand a bit. Aside from the fact that Lilla knew both sides of the equation and they got a tip about her, they really had nothing to connect her to John's murder, but they made it sound like they did. Bobby eventually decided, without a lawyer and over the course of a few days, to negotiate a deal with the prosecution, which included confessing to shooting Dr. John Hill for pay. It was a contract killing, and the person who paid him was Lilla Paulus.
Melasma, aging skin, menopause symptoms, hair loss.
These conditions can make you feel like you're not yourself. Muesli can help. Traditional healthcare often dismisses these conditions, but Muesli connects you with board-certified doctors who prescribe customized treatments so you can overcome them. Order in just 3 minutes, 100% online, and have it delivered to your door. Feel like yourself again. Visit muesli.com/podcast and use code podcast25 for 25% off your first order. Muesli. Look good, live better.
Did you know using your browser in incognito mode doesn't actually protect your privacy? Take back your privacy with IPVanish VPN. Just one tap and all your data, passwords, communications, browsing history, and more will be instantly protected. IPVanish makes you virtually invisible online. Use IPVanish on all your devices, anytime you go online at home and especially on public Wi-Fi. Get IPVanish now for 70% off a yearly plan with this exclusive offer at ipvanish.com/audio.
Bobby said that when he first talked to Lilla about this situation, she said the target was a doctor who had killed his wife. Lilla told Bobby that the contract had been out for a while, but she was having trouble finding someone to complete it because the doctor didn't keep regular hours. And Bobby told the police that Lilla said the person who wanted the doctor dead was the wife's father. Bobby was happy to take the money and the job, so he and Marcia worked it together. Marcia called John's office to ask about appointment time shortly before he left on his vacation, so they let her know that John would be out of the office for 10 days. The receptionist said something about a convention in Las Vegas, so Marcia called around and found out when and where the plastic surgeons convention would be held. After they found out what hotel John was staying at in Las Vegas, Marcia and Bobby decided to drive out there. They would kill him in Vegas, make it look like a robbery gone wrong, and no one would ever suspect two people unconnected to him had anything to do with it. So they went out to Las Vegas with a picture of John Hill that Lilla had given them, a picture which Bobby said was cut into the shape of a coffin, but Marcia and Bobby couldn't find John. They heard from Lila that maybe John had gone to Seattle, so they decided to drive back to Texas and figure it out from there. Bobby said they were in close contact with Lila the whole time they were gone, and she would refer to the old man and things the old man was saying. The implication was that the old man was behind the hit. After learning that John and Connie were coming back from Las Vegas, Marcia called the airline to figure out what flight they were on and when it would land in Houston. So then they did the math on how long it would take John to get back to his house. So Marcia drove them out to the house and Bobby went inside to wait on John. He then murdered John Hill in exchange for $5,000. With Bobby in custody and his confession implicating both Marcia and Lila, you'd think they might be ready for court. With Marcia, they were because they could link her to the murder through the murder weapon, so they just had to find her. But with Lila, in Texas, you cannot be convicted on the testimony of a co-conspirator alone. They would need to find some evidence to link her to the crime. The police hoped they would be able to piece together the evidence they needed. So on April 25th, 1973, Bobby, plus 23-year-old Marcia McKittrick, plus 54-year-old Lila Paulus were all indicted for the murder of John Hill. While the state believed the old man Bobby referred to was Ash Robinson, Bobby never met him or even heard his name. So not only was it the testimony of a co-conspirator, it was hearsay, and it was hearsay that didn't even name Ash Robinson. They didn't have nearly enough for an indictment. So the police arrested Lila at her house, but Marcia remained free until September of 1973 when she got arrested for trying to cash a forged check, and they realized who she was. Lila denied everything to the police, but Marcia ended up giving a confession pretty close to Bobby's. But she had some added details because, according to Marcia, she actually met Ash Robinson. Unfortunately, for any case against Ash Robinson, Marcia never heard Ash tell her that he wanted John dead. Marcia claimed to see Ash at Lila's house and meeting up with her elsewhere, and that he had given her money a few times, but she didn't know what the money was for or how much money it was most of the time. However, on the day of the murder, Marcia said Ash came over to Lila's, counted out $7,000 in cash, and told Marcia that John would have a large sum of money on him that day, around $15,000. If that was true, that Bobby and Marcia believed John had that much money on him, it would explain why Bobby took the briefcase and also why Bobby said, after shooting John, where was the rest of his money? Because we know John didn't have that much cash with him. But maybe Bobby expected it. Marcia said after she dropped Bobby off at the Hills' home, she went to wait at a payphone for him to call and let her know where to pick him up. She said it took about an hour, but he called, she picked him up, and they drove straight to Lila's house. Lila paid Bobby the promised $5,000, but he gave her back $1,500 of it. $500 because she had paid for them to go to Las Vegas to look for John, and $1,000 as a finder's fee for setting up the job. But Marcia was under the impression that Lila had gotten more like $25,000 from the person ordering the hit, so in her eyes, Lila was making out pretty well. After this, Marcia and Bobby got out of town. They first went to Dallas, which was where they were when they found out that the gun had been found, and then they left the state, traveling around for months until they were finally caught, and more details of that time can be found in the book Blood and Money by Thomas Thompson. Marcia's confession had a lot of the pieces they needed, mostly against Lila, but it was still shaky on Ash unless they could find more evidence. Again, you cannot be convicted just on the testimony of a co-conspirator. But then, a week later, they didn't even have that when Marcia recanted her confession. She said she was going through heroin withdrawals at the time of her interrogation, and she just said whatever the police wanted her to say so that she could get moved to the hospital where she would be given help with her symptoms. So it wasn't clear that they would be able to get Marcia to testify even with a deal, but they still had Bobby. Until they didn't. Bobby Vandiver was free on bail and was due in court in April of 1974 for his trial. He knew he would be taken into custody at that point, so he just didn't show up. He was considered a fugitive, and because he had ties to various parts of Texas, they sent out alerts across the state. It turned out that the police in Longview, Texas had started noticing a new car around town, and it was registered to someone named J.C. Sheridan. They eventually got a tip that J.C. Sheridan was really Bobby Vandiver. When he was confronted by the police while playing pool one night, after about a month on the run, he pulled a gun, and the responding officer fatally shot Bobby Vandiver in the chest. There was no question, based on witness statements, that this was a justified shooting, but rumors started swirling that Bobby was killed as part of a contract hit to eliminate the people who could testify against those who ordered John Hill's murder. This was quite an accusation against a police officer, and an investigation showed that he did everything by the book. There was no indication this was anything but what it seemed, a man who didn't want to go back to prison, pulling a gun on the police. Meanwhile, Marcia continued to fight to get her confession thrown out, but when it was clear it was coming in at her trial, she and her defense attorney stipulated to facts, and she was convicted. She was given a 10-year prison sentence, and it was so short because she agreed to testify against Lilla Paulus. Lilla's trial was delayed due to her own health issues. In July of 1974, her attorney, Dick DeGuerin, said that her cancer had progressed enough that he didn't know if she would even live long enough to go to trial. But she did. And yes, Dick DeGuerin was her attorney, so we have had Richard Racehorse Haynes and Dick DeGuerin come up in this episode. And if you're wondering if Kelly Siegler is going to pop out of the bushes to round out our high-powered Texas attorney list, she won't. She was literally a child when all of this happened, but I did find quite a coincidence. I noticed during my digging on newspapers.com that someone with the last name Siegler bought Joan's horse farm from Ash Robinson after Joan's death. I wondered if there was any relation there, and this is why I struggle to finish my episodes on time. I fall down rabbit holes. After more digging, I found out that the man who bought Chatsworth from Ash Robinson would eventually become Kelly Siegler's father-in-law. So she does come up in this episode, sort of. Anyway, Lilla did live to go to trial, and a question I walked away with was, who was Lilla Paulus really? If you asked the state and her own daughter who testified against her, she was a madam who ran a brothel out of Galveston, horrifically allowed her daughter to be sexually abused as a child for money, and was married to a bookie who worked illegally. If you ask Lilla and some of her friends, she was a Girl Scout leader married to a businessman who enjoyed horse shows and did the best she could for a rebellious and out-of-control daughter. Some would claim she was a good friend of Joan Hill's and that she knew Ash Robinson well, but she would testify she was more of a friend of Joan's, and she knew Ash only on sight. He would say he didn't know who she was at all. So I don't know that any question about Lilla Paulus as a person was really answered, and the jury was more focused on answering the question about whether or not she hired Marcia and Bobby to kill John Hill. To bolster their case, the state admitted some items they found on a search of Lilla's house to the jury that they said showed she was connected. For instance, there was a piece of paper with the times of flights to Houston from Las Vegas jotted down, and it included the time of the flight John and Connie were on. According to Lilla's daughter, it was written in Lilla's handwriting. The state also had the phone calls Marcia said she made in the week leading up to the murder, the ones to Las Vegas and to the airline to figure out when the flight was, and those calls were on Lilla's phone bill. Even if every single one of those phone calls was made by Marcia, it backed up her story that she was with Lilla at her house at the time the murder was being plotted. And Marcia said that's because Lilla was orchestrating things. The state did have a few other smaller things, like the fact Lilla had Ash Robinson's unlisted phone number in her purse, in spite of claiming to hardly know him. And in her home, they found a note with the words, quote, "You had better tell Ash they are trying to subpoena Ma," end quote. Ma was the nickname used to refer to Rhea Robinson, Ash's wife. Again, Lila didn't know Ash, so why would this note be in her house? The answer, according to the defense, to the phone number and the note about the subpoena was that maybe Diane had left them behind. Diane, the house guest of Joan's who was around when she got sick, she stayed at Lila's house when she was in Houston in 1971 while testifying at John's trial. Lila's daughter Mary also testified, and one important piece she had was that she heard her mother talking to Diane about Ash looking for someone to kill John. That conversation happened around December of 1970, which backed up what Bobby and Marcia said about Lila saying the contract on John Hill had been out for a while. Diane, for her part, denied this conversation ever happened. In the end, the jury convicted Lila Paulus, and she was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Given her age and health condition, it was effectively a life sentence. She had a brief chance at reprieve when her conviction was overturned on appeal due to lack of evidence, but the state appealed that decision and her conviction was reinstated. She died behind bars in 1986. As for Ash Robinson, he never went to trial, at least not a criminal trial. Lila never said he ordered the hit, and she never admitted she was involved at all. She maintained her innocence until the end. To get into who else would have hired Marcia and Bobby to kill John Hill, it would require wild speculation about people who are no longer here to defend themselves, but Ash and Joan both had a lot of friends. Maybe one of them wanted revenge on their behalf, but without Ash's knowledge. Or maybe Lila felt an affinity for Joan, even though they didn't know each other well, and she arranged the whole thing herself. Marcia then made up the story about Ash Robinson under pressure of a police interrogation and in exchange for a pretty good deal. She ended up being paroled in 1979. The only trial Ash Robinson faced was a $7.6 million civil lawsuit for wrongful death filed by John's wife, Connie. Marcia took a lie detector test confirming Ash's involvement and passed, and Ash took a lie detector test denying his involvement and also passed. After a trial, the jury found that there was a conspiracy, but not enough to implicate Ash Robinson in it. You would think that would be the end of the lawsuits in this matter, but it was not. Thomas Thompson, the author of Blood and Money, a major source for these 2 episodes, was sued not once, not twice, but 3 times for defamation after his book came out. The lawsuits themselves weren't funny, but they didn't lack some comedic moments. Like when Ann Kurth, John's second wife, sued, saying that the depiction of her as a sex bomb, mistress, and demanding wife hurt her reputation. The ruling on the case was basically that, yes, he said those things, yes, they probably hurt her reputation, but they weren't actually defamatory because they were true. Ann Kurth ended up writing her own book called Prescription Murder, telling her side of the story, and she was very smart. She timed the release for right after this highly anticipated publication of Blood and Money, so the timing was perfect for sales. In her book, Anne gave the conspiracy theory that John Hill wasn't even murdered. He had another man stand in for him that night, and that's the person who was killed. He actually escaped to Mexico. This meant he was able to avoid retrial, and he got back at Ash Robinson because everyone would suspect that Ash was behind the killing. But this conspiracy would mean that John's wife, mother, and 12-year-old son were in on it, and that's just too hard of a pill for me to swallow. Another defamation suit Thompson faced was from the police officer who shot Bobby Vandiver. One passage he objected to, the one that's kind of funny, is as follows, quote, "With a tendency to flush red when angry or engaged in spirited work, John Raymer's round face, with a disappearing fringe of hair at the crown, resembled a hard-boiled egg. A few more pounds and he would be roly-poly, like a rubber beach toy, that bounces up every time it is knocked to the sand, but there was little about him to mark him as someone to remember." End quote. I mean, that wasn't very nice. It's certainly not flattering, but was it defaming? Raymer said it was because it was a publication of his natural defects and exposed him to public ridicule. This claim didn't even go to trial because the only Texas case that was even remotely like that, the natural defect that was defaming was basically calling someone mentally unstable. The court wrote, quote, "While mental imbalance may be a natural defect, baldness and pudginess hardly qualify," end quote. The only passage in the book that the court did allow to go to trial as possibly libelous was about how Raymer ran undesirables out of town, because that would be a violation of people's constitutional rights by an officer of the law, and it was essentially accusing Raymer of committing a crime. That one issue went forward, but he lost the case. The third defamation case came from none other than Ash Robinson. Though it has been reported that he was able to read the book prior to publication and that his only complaint was that it was too long, Ash accused Thompson of painting him out to be a murderer. And while I do agree that the book may leave some people with the impression that Ash was behind John's murder, I don't personally think it was the writing so much as Ash Robinson. The things he said and his motive to do it are what make people think he did it. Did he do it? I don't know. I read Thompson's book cover to cover twice, and I walked away unsure. But I can see why people reading it would come away with a different opinion. This case never went to trial. In 1982, Thomas Thompson died of cancer just 6 weeks after diagnosis, and then in 1985, Ash Robinson died. In Ash's final years, he did get a gift when he reconciled, sort of, with Joan's son. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. The accusations that John killed Joan and that Ash killed John would always be between them. But it sounds like a type of peace was made, and after everything that happened from Joan's death in 1969 to John's death 2.5 years later, to the criminal trials and the civil trials, the idea that any peace was found is pretty remarkable. As for what I think happened in these cases after covering it twice and rather extensively the second time, after reading Blood and Money more than once, after going through the newspaper archives and appellate documents and legal filings, like I said, I'm left unsure if Ash Robinson organized the murder of John Hill. I can imagine a scenario where he did. But I don't think Marcia McKittrick is 100% credible in her story. Implicating Ash Robinson is part of what got her a deal. I can just as easily imagine a scenario where everyone was talking about wanting John Hill dead, and Lilla opted to handle it herself, knowing that none of Joan's society-type friends would have the connections to get it done. I could go either way with it. As for what happened to Joan Robinson Hill, in 2023, ABC 13 News in Houston did a 45-minute retrospective on the case, and it left me feeling like I may be the last person on this planet who doesn't think John Hill killed his wife. I do think if John Hill killed someone with his conflict-avoidant personality, he would be likely to poison them and leave rather than stick around and commit a violent act. And I think he was a bad husband, at least to Joan. I think maybe he didn't care that Joan was sick with what looked like a stomach bug. I think he was more focused on seeing his girlfriend and making it to his music performances than taking care of a sick wife who he resented because he felt stuck in the marriage. And maybe that rose to the level of neglect at some point, since he was a doctor. But I don't think he intended for her to die. I just don't. In this case, there are a lot of people, a lot of complicated people, but I do want to end with my thoughts on just one of them, and that's because I want to end on a good note. John's widow, Connie, kept custody of John and Joan's son after John's death and raised him no differently than if she had been in his life from the beginning. This was a kid who lost his mother at 9 and his father at 12. And he was there when his father was murdered. She was suddenly the single mom of a traumatized boy entering his teen years. That's enough to make anyone want to run. But she remained a constant in his life when he had lost just about everything else. Of course, Joan and John would rather have been here to raise their son themselves. But I think if it had to be this way, they would be thankful that Connie stepped up.